his foreign policy speech, U.S. President Barack Obama says a real chance of achieving a breakthrough agreement with Iran is closer than ever.
Kept the world on our side.
A wave of attacks across Iraq kills at least 38 people, the latest in a protracted surge in bloodshed. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian expats cast ballots at 39 embassies ahead of presidential elections scheduled for June 3rd. And former Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi takes the lead as vote counting gets underway in Egypt. Good evening and welcome to Al-Attijah World News. I'm Maryam Khaddar. In a broad defense of his foreign policy, U.S. President Barack Obama praised ongoing diplomatic efforts between Iran and the P5+1 group over the Islamic Republic's nuclear energy program.
Despite frequent warnings from the United States and Israel and others, the Iranian nuclear program steadily advanced for years. But at the beginning of my presidency, we built a coalition that imposed sanctions on the Iranian economy while extending the hand of diplomacy to the Iranian government. And now we have an opportunity to resolve our differences peacefully. The odds of success are still long, and we reserve all options to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. But for the first time in a decade, we have a very real chance of achieving a breakthrough agreement, one that is more effective and durable than what we could have achieved through the use of force. And throughout these negotiations, it has been our willingness to work through multilateral channels that kept the world on our side.
On the issue of Syria, Obama vowed to increase U.S. support for militants fighting to overthrow the Damascus government. Ironically enough, the U.S. president also pledged additional support to regional countries fighting terrorism.
So with the additional resources I'm announcing today, we will step up our efforts to support Syria's neighbors, Jordan and Lebanon, Turkey and Iraq, as they contend with refugees and confront terrorists working across Syria's borders. I will work with Congress to ramp up support for those in the Syrian opposition who offer the best alternative to terrorists and brutal dictators. And we will continue to coordinate with our friends and allies in Europe and the Arab world to push for a political resolution of this crisis and to make sure that those countries, and not just the United States, are contributing their fair share to support the Syrian people.
But the centerpiece of Obama's address focused on the defense of his preference for acting as part of an international coalition instead of pressing ahead alone. The U.S. leaders cited recent efforts to rally European support for sanctions against Russia over the Ukrainian crisis.
In Ukraine, Russia's recent actions recall the days when Soviet tanks rolled into Eastern Europe. But this isn't the Cold War. Our ability to shape world opinion helped isolate Russia right away. Because of American leadership, the world immediately condemned Russian actions. Europe and the G7 joined us to impose sanctions. NATO reinforced our commitment to Eastern European allies. The IMF is helping to stabilize Ukraine's economy. OSCE monitors brought the eyes of the world to unstable parts of Ukraine. And this mobilization of world opinion and international institutions served as a counterweight to Russian propaganda and Russian troops on the border and armed militias in ski masks.
U.S. President Barack Obama also warned that the United States was ready to respond to what he called China's aggression toward its neighbors, but added that Washington should lead by example by ratifying a key treaty.
In the Asia Pacific, we're supporting Southeast Asian nations as they negotiate a code of conduct with China on maritime disputes in the South China Sea. And we're working to resolve these disputes.
For more on U.S. President Barack Obama's foreign policies, we have Chris Bambry, a political analyst, joining us via Skype from London. Mr. Bambury, let's just start with what President Barack Obama said about the Syrian crisis. Wouldn't Obama's pledge to support the Syrian opposition with armed training further hinder any efforts at a political solution?
Well, as you pointed out in your piece, it's also in complete contradiction to saying that he's prepared to support the governments of neighbouring states of Syria in their fight against terrorism, which is coming out of Syria, most notably in the case of Iraq. And really, I think at this stage in the game, given the longevity of the civil war in Syria, given the fact that the opposition is not going to win, that the best option Obama could have said was to return to the table at Geneva and begin the talks which had taken place there, aimed at bringing out a peaceful solution. Rather than saying they're going to provide military training for a section of the Syrian opposition who the Americans choose in Jordan and Turkey, and at the same time combat the other sections of the Syrian opposition who they oppose, the Al-Qaeda-linked groups. That's a contradiction, as I said, and as you said, but it also flies in the face of really what's the only possible option to the Syria crisis now, which is to resume the Geneva talks.
Right, and isn't it rather ironic that this announcement comes at a time when infighting between extremist groups is on the rise?
Well, it comes at a time when infighting between extremist groups is on the rise in Syria. It comes at a time when those same extremist groups are involved in killings in Iraq on a truly horrendous scale. But also we see the spread of the fight against the so-called war on terror, if you like, being extended into Africa. And Obama talked about that and talked about aiding countries like Nigeria and others in the region in that fight. So on the one hand, we have this pledge to continue the war on terror, albeit by different means from George W. Bush Jr. But at the same time, the Americans are going to aid sections of the Syrian opposition. It really doesn't sort of stick together, does it? It's not a coherent approach.
Right. Let's just change regions now. Obama reiterated that American leadership has shaped international opinion to isolate Russia through sanctions, NATO buildup, and OSCE monitors. So how will the Kremlin respond to all of this?
I think they'll think he has to say that, doesn't he? Because to be honest, the sanctions which have been implemented are having little effect. They've certainly influenced the actions of the Putin government. The Putin government have continued to steer a course saying they will not invade Ukraine, and indeed saying they will stand by the election results in Ukraine, despite the bluster of Obama comparing them to the old Soviet leaders who invaded Hungary and Czechoslovakia. It seems to me really that when he makes that statement, it's empty words, and really the Americans have done little to influence to counter Russian actions in the territory. At the same time, however, we have this sort of list of things which he holds up to do. One of which I thought was very interesting was he praised the International Monetary Fund for, quote, rescuing the economy of Ukraine. In reality, what the International Monetary Fund and the European Union are doing is enforcing austerity-type measures of the kind we've seen in Greece and other parts of Europe on Ukraine, which will decimate public services and living standards inside Ukraine. So I think it's kind of ironic that he praises the International Monetary Fund for what it's doing in Ukraine, which is going to beggar a large section of the population.
So would you agree with the assessment that the situation in Ukraine is engineered to simply drag Russia into a confrontation?
I think that the Americans are, if you like, talking up a confrontation, but at the same time, they're not in a position to make a confrontation with Russia. There is no way they're going to put troops on the ground. They pulled back from doing that in Syria, despite Obama's wish to do so, because there is no taste for war after Iraq and Afghanistan in the United States of America. And therefore, the Americans are not in a position when push comes to shove to militarily intervene in Ukraine. They will provide weapons, they'll provide training, they'll implement these sanctions, but it doesn't amount to that much. And really, it would seem to me once again that the only solution here is to resume the talks which were going on, if you recall, with the Ukrainians and the Russians and the Americans and the European powers to try and resolve this situation. Again, rather than this sort of half-hearted bluster, better to resume talking and to try and find a solution to this problem.
All right, let's finish off with how the U.S. plans to address a, quote, code of conduct with China over the maritime and territorial disputes over the South China Sea. What might this include?
I think the Americans are going to find themselves boxed in because really they are boxed into an alliance with Japan and indeed Taiwan. And I don't see the Japanese backing off on the issue of these islands which are disputed with China in the South China Sea. And therefore, while he's saying everyone should sit down and agree to this, sign this agreement, I don't think he can carry his allies with them. And America is a victim here. While Obama has said he wants to reorientate American foreign policy onto the Pacific region away from the Middle East, he is boxed into this alliance with Japan and Taiwan, which means it's very difficult to reach a rapprochement with China over these issues. And at the same time, Chinese strength is growing virtually every day. So again, I think the Chinese will be watching this and thinking this is a speech which actually hints at weakness strategically. And therefore, we don't need to respond. And we certainly don't need to kowtow to the Americans in this situation. We can bide our time. Time is to our advantage. It's not to the advantage of the United States. And Obama is soon going to be gone from the White House. And maybe we should just wait and see what we can get out of that.
All right, Mr. Chris Bambury, political analyst, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
At least 38 people were killed in a wave of terrorist attacks across Iraq, bringing this year's death toll up to more than 4,000. This as the Iraqi army killed dozens of militants belonging to the Islamic State of Iraq in the Levant, as it continues its operations in the country's west.
4,000 and counting. This is the gruesome figure reflecting the number of Iraqi civilians killed this year alone. At least 38 people were killed and dozens were wounded in the latest wave of bombings and shootings across Iraq. The day's deadliest violence struck Baghdad. 3 explosions struck several districts across the Iraqi capital in near simultaneous attacks, killing 20 people. 11 bombs across the ethnically mixed town of Tuzkhirmato also took the lives of 5 people and wounded several others. The northern town has been a point of contention between the semi-autonomous Kurdistan region and the central government in Baghdad, as Kurdish leaders seek to incorporate the town into their sphere of influence. As a result, extremist militants have exploited this dispute and have frequently carried out attacks targeting the ethnically Turkmen community. The spike in civilian casualties coincides with the Iraqi army's ongoing operations in the western province of Anbar against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. In its efforts to clear the province of militant groups, Iraqi security forces have announced that dozens of ISIL militants across Anbar were killed. Meanwhile, 11 fighters belonging to the extremist group were also killed during a military operation in the northern city of Mosul. The ongoing bloodshed comes against the backdrop of a heated political scene in Baghdad. With nearly a month following the country's general elections, political groups are now engaged in talks over what Iraq's next government will be and whether Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki will have a third term in office.
Hundreds of thousands of Syrian expats across the world streamed into polling stations to cast their ballots in the country's presidential elections, expressing hopes that the vote will bring peace and stability to their war-ravaged country.
Voting for Syrian expats kicked off on Wednesday at 39 embassies around the world, as hundreds of thousands flocked to their local embassies from the early hours of the morning to take part in their first multi-candidate presidential elections in recent history. In Lebanon, where at least 1.1 million registered refugees live, voters in their thousands flocked to the embassy in Yarzi, causing major traffic disruptions in and around Beirut. Enthusiasm prevailed among voters heading to the polls, with Syrian national anthems blaring from cars and buses decorated with pictures of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
I am coming to vote for Dr. Bashar Hafiz al-Assad because he is the best one in Syria as a president, army commander and people's leader. He is a president with all the sense of the world.
He is the president, he will stay the first and the last one. Whatever they do, they cannot defeat him because God is with Syria and Bashar.
We came to practice our normal right of voting. We are all surely with the President Dr. Bashar al-Assad, and we all prove that we are Syrian.
As the traffic from the voters increased, drivers began to park their cars further away and walk to the embassy to ensure that they had the chance to cast their ballots. Policemen from the internal security forces and the Lebanese army deployed near the embassy in a bid to control the traffic along the way. Due to the high voter turnout, the Syrian embassy in Lebanon announced that it has extended the voting hours to midnight on Thursday in order to allow all eligible voters to participate. In Jordan, hundreds of Syrians headed to their embassy in Amman to vote in the upcoming presidential election.
As long as the elections are taking place under the supervision of Dr. Bashar Hafiz al-Assad, then I'm sure that the situation after the elections will become better. We want to at least return to the way things were before the conflict.
The image was similar in Tehran, Baghdad, Moscow, and many other capitals around the world, with Syrians eager to take part in their country's first ever democratic elections in more than 50 years, hoping it will bring peace and stability to the war-wrecked country.
Well, Syrian expats living in Iran also cast their ballots for their country's next president. Our Tehran correspondent was at the Syrian embassy in the Iranian capital, and he filed this report.
Syrian expats living in the Islamic Republic are voting for their country's next president. Hundreds made their way to the Syrian embassy in the Iranian capital, Tehran, to cast their ballots.
The message today is freedom and democracy. We will continue to defend Syria in any way possible. Through the ballot boxes, as you can see, the people's message is clear today. On the ground, the Syrian government, along with the people's resistance, has made extraordinary gains. Our stance on the resistance will not change whatever the outcome may be. Today, we are witnessing that the Syrian people want to determine their country's future through the ballot box. This will restore peace and stability in Syria. Syrians are saying no to terror and no to interference from the West and neighboring countries to end the democratic system in the Arab Republic.
Many of the voters we met had families back in Syria and expressed their enthusiasm over participating in the first of this two-day election.
It feels good to know that I am here to vote for my next president. Syrians deserve this. For the past 3 years, our country has been attacked by militants supported by Western and unfortunately Arab and Muslim countries. I am proud to be here today because in a way I am protecting my country from further violence.
I feel excited to vote. I want my country to finally settle down. The past years have been very harmful for my country. My message here is clear that through the ballot box, changes can be made and not through violence. What is happening in Syria, the violence caused by our militants, has done nothing positive for Syria. Voting is the only way.
Expats are voting in 39 countries across the world, including Lebanon, Yemen, France, Germany, and Turkey. Today's the first day of voting for Syrians living abroad. Most of the Syrian expats living here in the Islamic Republic are students, and they have come out to choose their favorite candidate in the historic presidential election, which is set to kick off in their country next week. Reporting for AEE TV, Hussein Dabash, Tehran.
Russia has warned the U.S. against arming and training Syrian militants after a new report revealed that President Barack Obama is on the verge of formally signing off on the proposal.
With the Syrian army tearing through foreign-backed opposition strongholds, and infighting among the militant groups have left the opposition in tatters after 3 years of a devastating war. White House spokesperson Jay Carney told reporters on Air Force One that U.S. President Barack Obama is planning to announce a new U.S. position on arming the flailing militants. The report, though not confirmed yet, has caused uneasiness among the Russians. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was quick to denounce the move.
We are worried by information that among the measures declared regarding the US's support to Syrian opposition, there could be those such as military assistance to the opposition, the training of fighters by the American army, and also the US's preparedness to lift objections against supplies of mobile anti-aircraft systems to the opposition.
Officially, US support for Syrian opposition has been limited to non-lethal aid amounting to $287 million, though the CIA reportedly participates in a secret program to train on armed fighters described as moderate. In a documentary aired on Tuesday night on the American PBS broadcasting network, militants have alleged that it is the US who is providing them with weapons and ammunition.
ايوه الامريكان الامريكان بيحكوا معكم انه تاجتم سلاح ولا بالضبط نحن بيعطونا مثلا اليوم جهزوا حالكم واطلعوا في حموله.
Militants have for the first time revealed that they have also been receiving training by US operatives at a secret base in Qatar.
We only found out where we were going to be trained on the last day in Ankara, when the Americans said goodbye and that tomorrow we'll see you in Qatar.
They also trained us on how to attack a vehicle, raid it, retrieve information or weapons and munitions, and how to finish off soldiers still alive after an ambush.
After 3 years of fighting, and with the revelation that the US has for a long time been arming militants, it remains unclear how Washington's new strategy will help resolve the ongoing conflict.
Earlier, political analyst Dr. Redouane Rizk spoke to Alet Deja about these reports and the significance of the Syrian elections.
They know that they have lost the war, and the government led by Bashar al-Assad is just winning, and it's very close to announce victory. But the Americans and their allies, as I said, the Saudis and the Qatarian, the Israelis almost, that they are very interested in prolonging the war in Syria, so they can reach as much as total destruction to the country, which is not in the favor of the government, of course. So they are trying to change some sort of power balance on the ground, which is it's a game that cannot lead anywhere, because they are stuck there. The army is getting or gaining lots of lands on the ground, advancing on all fronts, and almost finishing most of the fighting groups. So the Americans are very desperate to hurt the Russians. They feel that they are hurting the Russians in Syria, and also that they want to. They know that the Bashar al-Assad is definitely will be elected as for the next term in office as a president in Syria. President Bashar al-Assad wanted to show the world, and the Syrian government wanted to show the whole world that Syria is turning to a real democracy, and this is the first election since 50 years. So this is done and achieved by the Syrian, the vision of President Bashar al-Assad, which is he was seeking to build up a real democratic country. Now he is proving that, and by implementing this kind of election, they are freely the Syrian people are freely electing or freely demonstrating into this kind of an election. They are free to choose their candidate. So now the Syrian people is deciding who's the next president and who's the legitimate president of Syria, and who is the person is going to lead Syria for the next 7 years. So the world is by this move, I believe this was very smart by the Syrian government to strip the whole world from propaganda or a chant that was saying that Syria is led by the dictatorship, and the President Bashar al-Assad has no backup of his people anymore. Yes. This is going to show exactly that how percentage or how well President Bashar al-Assad or any other candidate is backed up by his own people.
You're watching Alet Deja World News. Coming up after the break. Anti-World Cup protesters in Brazil clash with police. Welcome back. Our top stories this hour. In his foreign policy speech, U.S. President Barack Obama says a real chance of achieving a breakthrough agreement with Iran is closer than ever.
We've kept the world on our side.
A wave of attacks across Iraq kills at least 38 people, the latest in a protracted surge in bloodshed. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian expats cast ballots at 39 embassies ahead of presidential elections scheduled for June 3rd. And former Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi takes the lead as vote counting gets underway in Egypt. Vote counting is underway following Egypt's presidential elections. Preliminary results show that former Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has taken the lead, securing over 90% of the votes counted. Presidential frontrunner Sisi has garnered 78,000 votes, while his sole contender, leftist politician Hamdin Sabahi, only got around 4,000. Egypt's election commission extended the voting period by a day in a bid to boost a low turnout that threatened the authenticity of Sisi's inevitable win.
Day 3 of Egypt's presidential elections. Voters cast their ballots after the election commission unexpectedly extended the voting period, following a low voter turnout that had stood at 37% on Tuesday.
I thank God that they extended it one more day. I stayed up since yesterday night so that I would be the first one outside, and thank God.
The disappointing turnout had threatened to undermine the credibility of the vote, which is believed to have already been won by former Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Yet, Sisi's sky-high confidence may have cost him a high price.
Al-Sisi and his campaign team were pretty sure that voters liked him. He peaked too early, and this has made the election awkward.
The Egyptian Justice Ministry warned that eligible voters who did not go to polling stations would be fined, as it said it would not charge train fees in a bid to increase the number of voters. Yet, the reward and punishment system the Egyptian government has adopted may be overwhelming for the public.
Egyptians have been overwhelmed by politics the past 3 years. They have been through 6 general elections and referendums in 3 years. This election is the 7th. This is more than Egyptians can put up with.
Despite this, Egypt's presidential vote will most likely put Sisi in the lead and leave leftist politician Hamdin Sabahi disillusioned at having another shot at becoming president. Out of 54 million eligible voters across the Arab state's 27 provinces, only 37% voted, as the Muslim Brotherhood, along with many other 2011 revolution groups, boycotted the elections in protest against Sisi's heavy-handed crackdown. This is the second presidential election to be held in Egypt in 2 years, the first of which saw ousted President Mohamed Morsi come to power and then toppled by Sisi. Now, as Sisi looks determined on becoming president, many fear that the country will return to military rule and destroy what the 2011 revolution built after ousting former despot Hosni Mubarak.
The former U.S. National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden revealed that he was trained as a professional spy and worked for America's biggest intelligence agencies. Speaking during an interview with NBC News, Snowden defended himself against Washington's attempts to minimize his role and abilities.
The man who sent the world reeling from his revelations on U.S. mass surveillance and embarrassed Washington over its spying practices has reemerged with a new announcement to the public. In his first interview with a U.S. media outlet, the fugitive intelligence leaker Edward Snowden hit back at claims minimizing his experience in the world of espionage.
Well, it's no secret that the U.S. tends to get more and better intelligence out of computers nowadays than they do out of people. I was trained as a spy in sort of the traditional sense of the word, in that I lived and worked undercover overseas, pretending to work in a job that I'm not, and even being assigned a name that was not mine. But I am a technical specialist. I am a technical expert. I don't work with people. I don't recruit agents. What I do is I put systems to work for the United States. And I've done that at all levels, from the bottom on the ground all the way to the top.
The fugitive also told NBC News that he had worked covertly overseas as a technical expert for the CIA and the NSA, as well as a trainer for the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Now, the government might deny these things. They might frame it in certain ways and say, oh, well, you know, he's a low-level analyst. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to use one position that I've had in a career here or there to distract from the totality of my experience, which is that I've worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, undercover, overseas. I've worked for the National Security Agency, undercover, overseas. And I've worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency as a lecturer at the Joint Counterintelligence Training Academy, where I developed sources and methods for keeping our information and people secure in the most hostile and dangerous environments around the world. So when they say I'm a low-level systems administrator, that I don't know what I'm talking about, I'd say it's somewhat misleading.
Snowden, who has been charged in the United States with espionage, was granted asylum in Russia in August of 2013 after shaking the American intelligence establishment to its core with a series of leaks on mass surveillance in the United States and around the world. The leaks deeply embarrassed the Obama administration, which in January banned U.S. eavesdropping on the leaders of friendly countries and began reining in the sweeping collection of Americans' phone data in a series of limited reforms triggered by Snowden's revelations. To many in the U.S. government and at the NSA, Snowden is a traitor who compromised the security of the United States. But for many around the world, he is a hero who protected privacy and civil liberties. And after 10 months of being a fugitive, he is still able to turn the U.S. into a target of criticism.
Ukrainian fighter jets are still hovering over the eastern city of Donetsk. One helicopter was shot down as the death toll from the deadly offensive continues to rise. This as Russia reiterated its willingness to cooperate with the new authorities.
Counting votes in the west and casualties in the east, Ukraine's presidential elections that coincided with the deadliest military operations have highlighted the stark divisions amongst Ukrainians. Here in Donetsk, piles of corpses are still scattered all over the streets. In hospital, even more people are dying as a result of their wounds. The number of victims has already surpassed 100 since the outset of a military campaign led by Kiev forces against self-defense activists. Brief periods of calm have served as a prologue for more air assaults. One Ukrainian drone was shot down in the early hours, while gunfire could still be heard in the area. The people of Donetsk took to the streets to defy the military operations. Anti-Kiev protests were staged in the city center. Demonstrators demanded that an independence referendum be implemented and called on Kiev to pull out its troops.
We held a referendum that showed that 90% of Donbass voted for the referendum, and they said it was all falsified. It wasn't falsified, that's why we came here.
I came in a sign of protest against what the so-called authorities in Kiev are doing now. I definitely don't consider them the legitimate authorities.
But if there was any indication that the crackdown may end anytime soon, it does not look like it will come from the new president. Petro Poroshenko has already made it clear he has no intention of ending the deadly crackdown. He instead pledged to strengthen the army, a top priority during his reign. Russia, meanwhile, confirmed its stance of respecting the results of the elections. The statement comes ahead of a highly anticipated meeting between French President François Hollande and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Paris on the 70th anniversary of D-Day, a date which observers fear could be reenacted under the current circumstances.
Fresh anti-World Cup demonstrations have yet again paralyzed various parts of Brazil as social groups protested against the billions of dollars spent on the tournament, only weeks ahead of the kickoff of football's biggest event.
As the world anxiously awaits the World Cup, which is set to kick off in 2 weeks' time, thousands of homeless workers and indigenous groups from central Brazil marched towards the huge Grinch Stadium in the capital, Brasilia. Dressed in traditional costumes, some with bows and arrows, protesters were met in the middle of the highway with armed riot police. The troops opened fire with tear gas and stun grenades, forcing protesters to flee, with some turning to fire their primitive weapons as they fled. 7 World Cup games will be played in the Brasilia Stadium, the most costly of Brazil's 12 venues, which, according to some reports, has cost $900 million to build. That's money protesters believe should have been directed elsewhere, such as social housing and education. But as the opening World Cup match draws closer, the Brazilian government's handling of protests during the tournament will be under the spotlight, and how Brazil's military police deal with such demonstration under the gaze of the world's media is also going to be a big test.
The Taliban has condemned U.S. President Barack Obama's announcement that American troops will remain in Afghanistan until the end of 2016.
The extremist militant group released a statement lambasting the latest comments by US President Barack Obama concerning the continued occupation of Afghanistan by American troops. Now that Obama has announced that he will keep around 10,000 troops until the end of 2016 and continue their occupation, Afghanistan Islamic Emirate condemns it and considers it a violation of sovereignty, religion and human rights. Earlier on Tuesday, Obama outlined the US strategy to end America's longest war, 15 years after the September 11 attacks, by confirming that the 32,000-strong US deployment in Afghanistan would be scaled back to around 9,800 by the beginning of 2015.
At the beginning of 2015, we will have approximately 9,800 U.S. service members in different parts of the country, together with our NATO allies and other partners.
Those forces would be halved by the end of 2015 before eventually being reduced to a normal embassy presence with the security assistance component by the end of 2016.
By the end of 2015, we will have reduced that presence by roughly half, and we'll have consolidated our troops in Kabul and on Bagram Airfield. By the end of 2016, our military will draw down to a normal embassy presence in Kabul.
NATO combat troops are due to withdraw from the country by the end of 2014, but a residual US force is expected to remain behind for training exercises and so-called counter-terror missions if both countries sign a long-delayed bilateral security agreement. Tension between the two countries is already high, with outgoing Afghan President Hamid Karzai throwing cold water on the agreement. However, both of the candidates vying to be his successor in next month's runoff vote, Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, have said they will sign the deal, though the Taliban are insisting US troops pull out immediately. The American leaders should do now what they plan to do 2 years later. If the Americans really want to free themselves from the Afghan war, they should completely withdraw their soldiers from Afghanistan. The United States and its allies invaded Afghanistan in October 2001 as part of Washington's so-called War on Terror. The offensive removed Taliban militants from power, but even after all these years, foreign troops have been unable to establish security and stability in the country.
Delegations from Japan and North Korea met in Stockholm this week for talks over the two countries' lingering disputes. The head of the Japanese delegation told a news conference that negotiations over the past 3 days have been straightforward, as Tokyo urged Pyongyang to exercise restraint over its nuclear weapons program.
I believe that we are able to hold frank discussions on a wide variety of topics that were brought up by both sides. We have agreed to hold further discussions between Japan and North Korea, but have yet to decide on an exact timing for them to take place.
Back in Tokyo, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe warned Beijing against the use of force in the South China Sea, saying his country would work with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to ensure that the rule of law is respected.
China is looking to change the status quo in the South China Sea through the use of force. We will work with ASEAN countries to assert that the rule of law should be respected.
The UN Security Council has passed a resolution allowing peacekeepers in South Sudan to focus on protecting civilians. The 15-member body authorized the use of force by UN troops to protect unarmed civilians amid ongoing violence in the world's youngest nation. Fighting between the South Sudanese army and forces loyal to former Vice President Riek Machar is continuing in a blatant breach of a recently signed truce. Thailand's military-run TV channel has aired footage showing several high-profile political detainees who had been taken into custody following last week's coup. Other protest leaders who had been summoned also appeared in police stations for questioning as the Thai military consolidates its grip on power following the ouster of former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra. After returning to the Vatican, Pope Francis said that he had given and received hope during his visit to the Middle East.
I wanted to bring a word of hope, but I also received hope. I received it from the brothers and sisters who hope above all hope after having suffered much, as those who have had to flee their countries because of conflict, as those who in many parts of the world are discriminated against and looked down upon because of their Christian faith. We must stay close to them and pray for peace in the Holy Land and in all of the Middle East.
A scanner that can identify the chemical composition of liquids sealed within any non-metallic container is being trialed in European airports. The Insight 100 can detect liquids within 5 seconds, and according to its developers, could soon help airports end the universal liquids ban in operation since 2006.
Taking baby foods through airport security is a major headache for parents travelling with young children. But now there's a potential solution. The Insight 100 scanner, which can analyse liquids within 5 seconds without the need to open containers. The scanner is on trial in 65 European airports, including here at Bristol, and its developers believe it could help end the 8-year global travel restrictions on liquids. Designed by Cobalt Light Systems, the Insight 100 uses an improved version of conventional Raman spectroscopy laser detection, says Security Vice President Ken Mann.
The problem has been historically you would need line of sight to the item you're looking at or the material you're trying to analyse. With our technique, spatially offset Raman spectroscopy, we can go through barriers, be they plastic or glass, coloured glass, cardboard, various materials, and we can see what's inside without having to open them.
The device screens liquids, aerosols and gels and can be used alone or in conjunction with X-ray machines.
We shine a laser at the bottle and analyse the light that's coming back, compare that with a spectrum and a library of threat materials. If it's a threat, then we alarm. If it's not, it's not. It's very, very specific, so we have a very, very high level of detection and almost no false alarms.
In initial trials, false detection rates were 0.5%. And Airport Security Officer Lauren Inglis says it's easy to use.
You just put the liquid into the machine, close the door, and then in a few seconds it'll clear.
Hand luggage restrictions on liquids were introduced globally in 2006 after plots to detonate liquid explosives on board international airliners were uncovered. Pending European regulations envisage that emerging technologies will allow airports to end the ban by 2016. Bristol Airport Head of Security Chris Ware believes this machine could be the answer and says his passengers are already reaping the benefits.
Before the Cobalt Insight 100 came in, passengers, particularly families, young families travelling through, parents were required to actually test and taste in our presence 50% of the liquids, the baby food that they were travelling through. This process allows us to keep the product pristine so that the mothers and the families travelling together are confident that their baby food is actually fit for purpose during the journey.
and it does so, says Ware, without compromising passenger safety.
A British airline is examining the possibility of using drones to inspect planes which may have been damaged after flying into birds or being hit by lightning. EasyJet says the technology is likely to be more efficient and effective than manpower alone.
Damaged planes can be costly for airlines. They tie up engineers' time and leave passengers waiting. But British airline EasyJet says it hopes using drones to inspect damaged planes will speed up the process. The drones can be programmed to make an initial scan and assessment of the planes, and Head of Engineering Ian Davies says it's more efficient for the engineers.
They spend 90% of their time inspecting the aircraft where there's no damage. The idea here is to isolate the damage quickly and then use the human being to do the damage assessment more quickly. So this is not about de-skilling the process, it's about using the human being in the best, most efficient way.
EasyJet's drone development is still in its early stages, and the airline is working with the Bristol Robotics Laboratory to perfect the process. Arthur Richards says the idea of inspecting planes was a new idea for the laboratory team.
We are continually excited about the idea of drones for inspection. It's a role that they're very good at. So we thought about bridges and chimneys and difficult to get at infrastructure. Strangely enough, I work in an aerospace department and we hadn't really thought about inspecting aircraft with them. So it was a very nice discovery for us.
The airline says there is more work to be done in accurately controlling the drones, but it plans to begin trials in the next few months. And it hopes it won't be too long before the drones are regular members of the maintenance crew.
I think 2 to 3 years' time we will be actively using this. This is not expensive technology, we know that, and the cost of these are coming down all of the time. So I think there is a possibility, a good possibility, that within 3 years we could actively be using this.
EasyJet says the drones are part of a range of technology innovations aimed at improving services for passengers and making sure their planes spend less time on the ground.
You've tuned in to Al World News. Here's a last look at our headlines. In his foreign policy speech, U.S. President Barack Obama says a real chance of achieving a breakthrough agreement with Iran is closer than ever.
We've kept the world on our side.
A wave of attacks across Iraq kills at least 38 people, the latest in a protracted surge in bloodshed. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian expats cast ballots at 39 embassies ahead of presidential elections scheduled for June 3rd. And former Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi takes the lead as vote counting gets underway in Egypt. That's all for this bulletin. Have a good night.